Did your family have favorites? If so, were you the favorite or someone else?
I remember the moment they told me I had to stay home while my brother went on a cruise across Europe like it was yesterday, and I can still feel the knot in my stomach tightening as if it had never left. Because it was one of those moments when everything inside you wants to scream, to argue, to demand fairness, but you already know arguing will get you nowhere, so you swallow it and nod, telling yourself you're being responsible, that this is what's expected of you, and yet, deep down there, is this voice whispering that life has already chosen sides and somehow, inexplicably, I had ended up on the losing team. My parents stood in the living room, both smiling with that combination of pride and smugness that I had come to recognize as the usual blend they reserved for my brother, and my brother, of course, was bouncing with excitement, waving a brochure full of sun-soaked cities, luxury hotels, and cruises that I could only imagine in passing, the kind of trip that had been promised to him for his birthday but somehow never once thought to be offered to me even in the most casual, offhand way, and I could see it in their eyes that this wasn't even a question, it wasn't a discussion, it was a decision already made. And the message was perfectly clear: I am the adult, I am the responsible one, I am the one who keeps everything running, but I am never the one who gets to enjoy the rewards of it. And the moment passed so quickly that I barely had time to process it before my father turned to me and said, "We need you here to make sure everything is handled while your brother is gone, and we know we can count on you to be responsible," and it was said with this gentle, almost affectionate tone that made it impossible to argue without sounding ungrateful. But in that instant, I felt the sting of being invisible, the familiar ache that had accompanied every sacrifice I had made that had gone unnoticed, and every favor I had done that had been taken for granted. I didn't argue, not because I wasn't angry, but because I had learned long ago that arguing with them never led anywhere except to headaches and long evenings filled with tension and guilt, and instead I nodded, forcing a smile that I hoped looked natural. And I said, "Of course, I'll handle everything," while every part of me wanted to tell them exactly what I thought, to let them know that the way they treated me, the way they always treated me like a second thought, was unfair, but I held my tongue because I knew that fairness had never been part of this household's vocabulary when it came to me. My brother, on the other hand, was practically vibrating with excitement, talking nonstop about the cities he would visit, the food he would eat, the adventures he would have, and I listened with a mix of resignation and quiet fury, feeling the weight of responsibility pressing down on me even as my mind refused to settle, knowing that when they returned, they would expect everything to be exactly as it was, as if I had been nothing more than a placeholder, a shadow of someone whose only job was to keep things from falling apart while the people they loved were living their best lives. And the unfairness of it all made my jaw ache from clenching and my chest tighten in a way that felt almost physical. As they left, suitcases rolling behind them and my brother chattering endlessly about the cruise itinerary, I closed the door and took a long, quiet breath, trying to calm the storm of thoughts running through my mind, reminding myself that I had done this before, that I had survived these moments countless times, that I had always endured, and yet this time, it felt different, heavier, more insulting, because I wasn't just being asked to stay home and be responsible, I was being asked to witness the rewards I had sacrificed for being handed to someone else, and it felt as if the universe had singled me out to remind me of my place, and I sat down at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee I didn't even want, staring at the bills stacked neatly on one side and the tasks that awaited me, and I realized in that moment that no one would thank me, no one would notice if I handled everything perfectly, and yet somehow I would have to do it, because that had always been my role. Because responsibility in this house had always been code for invisibility, and because my silence was the only way to survive without being accused of ingratitude or selfishness. I started making a list of everything that needed to be done, from paying bills to grocery shopping to making sure the lawn got watered, each task a reminder of the life I had to lead while my brother lived in luxury. And I found myself thinking about how unfair it was that I had to work so hard for things that were already mine, and yet I had learned that the only power I had in situations like this was control over how I responded. And I decided I would respond with patience, observation, and Careful attention, because if they thought I was powerless, they were wrong, and while I didn't know exactly what I would do with the knowledge I was gathering, I knew instinctively that this situation would not stay like this forever. Every few hours, I found myself imagining the contrast between their days filled with excitement and mine filled with endless chores. The unfairness of it gnawed at me, but I also realized that anger alone wouldn't help me, that it would only make me lose focus. And focus was what I needed if I wanted to understand the full extent of what was happening in my family. And as the hours passed, I began noticing patterns in the house that had gone unnoticed before, small signs that things were handled differently depending on whose name was attached to them, bills that my brother never contributed to being paid by me, groceries that he ate without ever thinking of paying, and little luxuries that he would enjoy while I remained behind to keep everything together. And a quiet plan began forming in my mind, the beginnings of a strategy that would, when the time came, give me a voice where I had been silenced, power where I had been ignored, and satisfaction where I had been wronged. By the time evening came, I was exhausted, not just physically but emotionally, carrying the weight of unfairness, expectation, and suppressed frustration, and yet there was a strange calmness underneath it, a certainty that things were not as simple as they seemed, that every move my family made could be observed, remembered, and eventually turned into an advantage. And as I sat down to make a final list of chores for the week, I realized that when they returned, they wouldn't recognize the person they thought they had controlled, the quiet, obedient sister who never questioned their decisions, and I smiled faintly at the thought, knowing that patience and attention would give me what anger never could. And in that moment, I understood that this was only the beginning, that the real story had yet to unfold, and that by the time my brother and parents returned from their cruise, everything would be different, though I couldn't yet see how or when, but I knew it would be. The days stretched out in a rhythm that was both familiar and maddening, each one blending into the next with a quiet insistence that I stay focused on the tasks at hand while my brother was off enjoying a life I had been denied, and I found myself rising early, checking every corner of the house to make sure that nothing had gone amiss, making lists of groceries and bills and minor repairs that somehow always ended up being my responsibility, and yet there was a strange satisfaction in the efficiency of it, a sense of control over a world that always seemed to favor others, because while my brother was gallivanting across Europe, snapping photos and sharing updates that my parents seemed to hang on every word of, I was quietly keeping the house afloat, making sure that no one would notice any gaps, that no one would suspect that I was aware of the subtle inequities that had been laid bare when they left, and every time I checked the accounts, paid a bill, or organized a closet, I felt this low, simmering anger that had nothing to do with chores and everything to do with the realization that my efforts were being taken for granted while someone else received the accolades, the adventure, and the freedom that I had been denied. And it was impossible not to notice how easy it was for them to enjoy luxury while the responsibility fell squarely on me. It began with small things at first, a missing bottle of cleaning solution that I had purchased, a set of new dish towels that vanished without explanation, and then escalated to noticing that certain bills had been unpaid. Money that I had carefully allocated and tracked disappearing from accounts I managed, and with each discovery, the sense of injustice deepened, but I did not confront anyone because there was no one to confront, no one present to explain themselves, and my anger was tempered by the understanding that confrontation without evidence would only make me seem paranoid or ungrateful, so I documented everything in quiet notes, careful spreadsheets, and mental reminders, turning what could have been frustration into strategy, because I had always known that patience, observation, and preparation were more powerful than rash confrontation in a house where I was routinely undervalued. Every afternoon, I walked through the rooms, running my hands over counters and shelves, checking that the lights worked, the appliances functioned, and the laundry was done, and while these tasks would have been monotonous under any other circumstances, in this moment, they became a meditation on control, a way to assert some small dominance in a situation where power had been systematically denied to me. And as I organized the pantry, moved furniture to accommodate cleaning, and made lists of Everything that required attention, I also started noticing little patterns in behavior, the way my brother's belongings were prioritized when they came home, the way certain food or luxuries were reserved for him without acknowledgement of my contribution, and the way my parents seemed incapable of seeing that I had already been carrying the weight of the household alone, and it struck me that while I had always known there was a hierarchy in my family, the depth of its imbalance was something I had never fully appreciated until I was left completely alone with responsibility and no reward. I started noticing other things too, small inconsistencies that at first seemed insignificant but gradually formed a pattern that I could no longer ignore, like receipts for purchases I had made that were missing, savings that had been withdrawn from accounts I managed, and personal items that were rearranged or gone entirely, and the more I saw, the more a quiet fury began to build inside me, one that I could feel in my jaw and shoulders and the pit of my stomach. A sense of betrayal that was both profound and deeply personal, because it wasn't just about the cruise or the chores, it was about being disregarded in every way that mattered, treated like a placeholder while my brother received every reward, every adventure, and every privilege that I had worked for, and knowing that when they returned, they would pretend nothing had changed, that I would be expected to smile and nod and continue to perform the invisible labor that kept everything running. And yet, amid the frustration and the exhaustion, there was a strange clarity, a recognition that I had a unique advantage in the quiet, the isolation, the control I had over the house and its operations, and I began to think strategically, imagining ways to turn the knowledge I was gathering into leverage, to transform the unfairness into an opportunity, to make the eventual return of my family not a moment of humiliation for me, but a stage on which I could expose and reclaim what had been taken, to assert my presence in a way that could not be ignored. And as I prepared meals and handled finances and managed every small detail, I began to construct a mental blueprint of actions, contingencies, and revelations that would give me control without them ever suspecting until the moment I chose to reveal it. By the end of the week, the quiet of the house had become a weapon, a space in which I could observe, think, and plan without interference, and as I sat down one evening with my laptop, reviewing expenses and missing items, I realized that the seemingly endless chores, the quiet frustration, and the invisibility I had endured were not weaknesses but tools, instruments that allowed me to gather knowledge and build a strategy in a way my family could never anticipate. And I felt a mix of satisfaction, anticipation, and restrained excitement at the thought of what was to come, knowing that when they returned, the imbalance they had taken for granted would no longer serve them, that my patience and attention would be rewarded, and that the quiet storm I was nurturing would eventually become a force they could not ignore. And in that moment, I allowed myself the smallest, secret smile at the idea that I was no longer powerless, that the game had changed, and that the first moves had already been made in a battle they didn't even know was underway. The day they came back from their cruise, I remember feeling a strange mixture of exhaustion, anticipation, and a simmering tension that had been building for weeks while I had been holding the household together alone. Because the reality of living without recognition for everything I had done was already heavy, and now the moment of reckoning was arriving without warning, as if the universe had finally decided to test whether patience, observation, and quiet strategy could hold against the sight of everyone else returning with their carefree attitudes, their smiles and stories, and the scent of adventure still clinging to them. And I knew instantly that nothing would be simple, that this was the point where all the unseen work I had done would either be ignored entirely, as it always had been, or it could finally become the leverage I had quietly prepared for. And even though my body was tired, my mind snapped into high alert as I waited for the door to open. When my parents and my brother stepped into the house, the first thing I noticed was how they walked through it with that familiar sense of entitlement, as if nothing could possibly have changed while they were away. As if the weeks I had spent managing everything single-handedly were irrelevant, and my brother immediately started unloading souvenirs, showing off pictures of places I had never been, telling stories of dinners, excursions, and adventures that I had been denied. And as he laughed And my parents listened with indulgent smiles. My chest tightened because I realized they had no awareness of the imbalance, that they still saw him as the favored child who deserved everything without effort, while I remained invisible, and even as my heart ached, I reminded myself that the real power was in observation, in patience, and in knowing more than they did about what had happened in the house while they were gone. It didn't take long for me to start noticing subtle differences that immediately set off alarms in my mind. The way certain items were missing, the groceries I had carefully organized had been used or taken without acknowledgement, bills had been altered, and money I knew should have been accounted for was suddenly gone from accounts that I had managed, and it hit me like a wave that the absence of my family had been the perfect cover for my brother to indulge himself at my expense, while I had been left to keep things running and watch him benefit from a freedom and luxury I had been denied, and the unfairness of it gnawed at me, sharp and insistent, because it was no longer abstract or theoretical, it was tangible, immediate, and undeniable, and yet I had to be careful not to reveal that I knew, because if I did, I would simply be accused of jealousy or suspicion, and the opportunity to reclaim control would be lost. As the afternoon progressed, I began taking mental notes of everything that had changed, cataloging missing items, irregularities in accounts, and alterations in spaces I knew had been meticulously organized, and with each discovery, my anger grew. But it was accompanied by a clarity I had not expected, because I realized that the very things that were being taken for granted, the very items and responsibilities that had been my burden, were now the tools I could use to turn the tables, and I started envisioning a strategy that was precise and deliberate, one that would expose the imbalance, reclaim what was mine, and do so in a way that could not be dismissed. Because by now I understood that subtle hints and quiet reminders were not enough in a family that thrived on ignoring discomfort if it did not affect them directly. My brother, oblivious to the tension, continued to boast about his experiences, showing pictures, recounting meals, and bragging about excursions, while I kept my voice calm and neutral, asking occasional questions that seemed innocent but were carefully designed to gauge my parents' attention and priorities, and I could feel my father's and mother's eyes gliding over me, still unaware of the storm brewing just beneath the surface, and I realized that while they were focused on stories and souvenirs, the real story, the one that mattered, was unfolding in the invisible records of accounts, missing items, and the meticulous memory of weeks I had spent running a house that they could not even recognize as being in order without my presence. By the evening, I had formulated the first phase of what I now understood as my plan, a strategy that would start with quietly documenting every discrepancy, every inconsistency, and every instance of exploitation, and then gradually transforming these observations into leverage, using patience, timing, and psychological pressure to ensure that when I made a move, it would be undeniable and powerful. Because I had learned long ago that direct confrontation without preparation only led to dismissal, but preparation, observation, and subtle maneuvering could turn even the most oblivious family members into unwitting participants in a plan that served my interests. And I felt a sense of satisfaction and anticipation that I hadn't allowed myself in years, because finally, the power dynamic had shifted in a way that I could control. The night ended with my brother bragging about a particular excursion, unaware that while he had been off collecting memories, I had been quietly collecting the evidence, the knowledge, and the awareness that would soon make everything they had taken, every moment of disregard, every assumed privilege, a weapon in my hands, and as I went to bed that night, exhausted but alert, I understood that the real challenge had only just begun, that the return of the family was not the end, but the beginning of the reckoning, and that every detail, every slip, and every unguarded moment would be mine to use when the time came to turn the tables, and I felt an almost thrilling certainty that the moment when justice, subtle but devastating, would arrive was closer than they could possibly imagine, and it would be brilliant. Once the initial wave of their return settled into the predictable rhythm of casual conversation, laughter, and the usual post-vacation boasting, I realized that waiting and observing alone would no longer suffice. Because the imbalance was no longer theoretical, it was concrete, measurable and unavoidable, and I understood with absolute clarity that if I wanted to reclaim control over what had been taken from me, I had to act in a way that was deliberate, clever, and unavoidable, targeting not just the missing items or financial discrepancies, but the deeper patterns of entitlement and disregard that had allowed my brother and parents to believe that their pleasure could exist at my expense without consequence. And I began to formulate the first moves with meticulous attention to timing, reaction, and leverage, knowing that the smallest misstep could undermine everything I had been quietly preparing for weeks. The first move had to be subtle, something that would appear innocent on the surface, but carry weight in its consequences, and I chose the household accounts as the initial arena because it was both familiar and overlooked. A space I had managed with precision while everyone else assumed their finances would somehow reconcile themselves, and I spent the afternoon quietly reviewing statements, receipts, and spending patterns, cross-referencing purchases, withdrawals, and unusual transfers. Against my meticulously kept notes and mental logs, each discovery sharpening my awareness of just how far my brother had extended his privileges and how little my parents had actually noticed, and as I documented each inconsistency, I began crafting small, pointed questions and remarks designed to elicit reactions that would reveal their awareness, or lack thereof, without appearing accusatory, because the power lay in their obliviousness as much as in the evidence itself. While I spoke with my mother about grocery lists, minor household repairs, and the need for careful budgeting, I inserted questions with a calculated casualness, asking whether she had noticed certain missing items, whether she remembered paying particular bills, or whether she had seen my brother's credit card receipts, and every slight hesitation, every overly casual deflection, and every uncertain glance was catalogued in my mind as evidence. A psychological breadcrumb that mapped the true depth of their ignorance and complacency, and I recognized with quiet satisfaction that the more I guided the conversation, the more I subtly exposed the fractures in their narrative without ever raising my voice. Because confrontation without control was useless, but control without confrontation could reshape the entire power dynamic in ways that were both clever and devastating. Meanwhile, my brother continued to behave as though the house was still his playground, leaving belongings out of place, using appliances without permission, and speaking with a smug confidence that his adventures entitled him to overlook the contributions and sacrifices of others, and every careless action, every unguarded statement, every moment of assumed privilege became data in my mind, building toward a plan that was no longer just about reclaiming material items, but about exposing the injustice of their behavior in a way that could not be ignored or minimized, and I found myself drafting mental scenarios for the perfect timing of each revelation, the exact sequence in which discrepancies would be pointed out, and the strategic moments when patience and subtlety would yield maximum emotional impact. By evening, I had established the first tangible actions of my plan, beginning with a series of controlled discoveries that I could present casually, almost accidentally, while maintaining the appearance of routine household management. Starting with discrepancies in the pantry, where certain items were clearly gone despite having been accounted for when I last checked, moving on to financial records in which missing funds were carefully documented, and culminating in small, pointed questions about belongings that had inexplicably disappeared from shared spaces, each revelation designed to produce a reaction, a ripple of awareness that would begin to unsettle the comfortable complacency of my family. And the beauty of it was that each step appeared natural, mundane even, which made it impossible for them to respond with defensiveness or accusation without revealing their own oversight. I remember the subtle shift in their demeanor that evening, the way my father paused when I casually asked about a particular expense, the way my mother seemed to recheck receipts she had previously considered reconciled, and the way my brother's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second when I mentioned a missing item he had used without acknowledgement, and I felt a surge of controlled triumph because this was the exact opening I had been waiting for. The first small crack in the armor of assumed privilege, a point from which the momentum of my plan could grow, and I recognized that patience, attention to detail, and careful orchestration were far more powerful than confrontation or anger. because the impact of these first moves would compound over time, building pressure, doubt, and awareness in my family while I remained calm, strategic, and entirely in control. As I went to bed that night, reviewing the subtle victories of the day in my mind, I felt an almost electric anticipation for the next steps, knowing that the evidence I had carefully gathered, the observations I had meticulously catalogued, and the strategic questions I had asked were now setting the stage for a series of revelations that would eventually force acknowledgement, restitution, and an emotional reckoning that my family had never imagined was possible. And even as I drifted off, I planned the next moves with precision, envisioning how each small act, carefully timed and executed, would bring the quiet but inevitable sense of justice closer to fruition, because I understood more clearly than ever that when patience, strategy, and insight were aligned, no assumed privilege or entitlement could withstand the weight of deliberate, intelligent action, and I allowed myself a private, restrained satisfaction at the certainty that the first moves had already shifted the balance in my favor, and nothing would be the same again. The days following my initial moves were filled with a tense, simmering quiet in the house that seemed to stretch endlessly, a silence that was not peaceful but charged, as if every unspoken thought and half-noticed action was a wire-strung taut with anticipation. And I could feel the subtle shift in energy from every glance, every hesitation, and every almost missed reaction, because my family had begun to notice that something was off, that the house they assumed was under control had been operating on a different logic while they were away, and I realized that the time for observation alone had ended and the moment for execution had arrived, a moment that required precision, timing, and an understanding of human psychology so acute that every interaction became a move in a game they did not even know they were playing, a game in which I held the invisible advantage, the knowledge that their comfort, entitlement, and obliviousness had created openings I would exploit with careful calculation. I began by calling a family meeting under the guise of discussing household routines and upcoming expenses, and as I laid out the agenda, I maintained a calm, neutral tone, speaking with the measured patience of someone who had been in control all along while hiding the intensity of the strategy one had been crafting for weeks, because I understood that any hint of anger or accusation would immediately undermine the effectiveness of my approach and allow them to dismiss my concerns as emotional, exaggerated, or petty, and so I framed each discrepancy as an innocent question, an observation made in passing, allowing my parents and my brother to reveal their own guilt, mismanagement, and entitlement in the process, without ever directly stating it. And as I watched their reactions, each hesitation, defensive posture, and flinch confirmed that the plan was working exactly as intended, that the groundwork I had laid with careful notes, mental catalogs, and small, calculated probes had primed them for exposure, and that the moment of confrontation could be escalated into a moment of irreversible clarity. I moved deliberately through the house, highlighting missing items that my brother had used or taken for granted, noting money that had been diverted or unaccounted for, and asking pointed questions about bills, expenditures, and responsibilities that had been neglected, all while maintaining a tone that was both casual and precise, never accusatory, and as each revelation came to light, the dynamic shifted, their casual confidence eroding with each acknowledgement, each pause, each glance at a receipt or list that confirmed my observations, and I could feel the tension building, the first stirrings of panic and discomfort where previously there had been certainty and entitlement, and it was thrilling in a way that was controlled and purposeful, because I knew that this was the exact leverage I needed to deliver the emotional payoff that had been denied to me for years. The crescendo of my plan came with the financial records, the meticulous spreadsheets and receipts that I had prepared as part of my quiet documentation, and as I presented them, showing the exact amounts, the discrepancies, and the ways in which my brother had profited at my expense while I maintained the household, the room shifted from casual conversation to stunned silence, a silence that was heavy with realization, disbelief, and, finally, acknowledgement, because there was no room for deflection, no way to dismiss the evidence without admitting to oversight or complicity, and I allowed them to sit in that silence long enough for the weight of their assumptions, privilege, and disregard to settle. Knowing that the emotional impact of seeing the consequences of their actions laid bare would be far more satisfying than any direct accusation or confrontation could have been. When my brother finally spoke, his voice was hesitant, defensive, and uncertain, betraying the first real cracks in his confidence, and as he attempted to explain or justify his actions, I remained calm, letting him stumble over his own rationalizations, knowing that the power had shifted completely, because now he was exposed, accountable, and unable to escape the reality that his freedom and pleasure had been built on the labor, patience, and diligence of someone he had always assumed would silently accept the imbalance. And as my parents began to understand the scale of what had occurred, the acknowledgement, apologies, and sudden awareness became almost tangible, a form of justice that required no physical confrontation. No drama beyond the simple, undeniable revelation of truth, and it was brilliant in its simplicity, effectiveness, and emotional impact. By the end of the evening, the dynamic in the house had shifted irrevocably, with my brother subdued, my parents aware of the consequences of their disregard, and me positioned not as a complainer or victim, but as someone who had quietly, strategically, and masterfully reclaimed control over my space, my contributions, and my authority, and while some resentment lingered in the air, it was paired with an undeniable acknowledgement that their assumptions had been challenged and overturned in a way that left no room for denial, deflection, or repetition of the same behavior. And as I reflected on the process, from the initial observation to the careful execution of subtle revelations and psychological leverage, I understood that the brilliance of the plan was not just in the exposure of wrongdoing, but in the emotional clarity it produced, the justice that felt earned, and the satisfaction of watching those who had underestimated and dismissed me finally recognize both the scope of their entitlement and the power of patient, intelligent action. And I went to bed that night knowing that the balance had shifted, that the house now operated under my terms, and that the first true recognition of my presence, efforts, and authority had been achieved without the need for anger, confrontation, or spectacle, a quiet but devastatingly effective victory that left them stunned and me victorious. The house was the same, yet entirely different, and as I finally allowed myself a deep breath of satisfaction, I knew that the brilliance of what I had accomplished was not in revenge for revenge's sake, but in the undeniable assertion of fairness, awareness, and intelligence. And while there were still minor tensions and unspoken questions, the core truth had been revealed, the inequity corrected, and the subtle, strategic power I had cultivated had reached its culmination, leaving my family to reckon with their assumptions and entitlement while I stood quietly, confidently, and completely in control of both the house and the consequences of their actions, and the knowledge that I had orchestrated this outcome with patience, precision, and insight was more satisfying than any immediate gratification could ever have been.